1944. World War II was reaching its dramatic climax.
Rocket ships firing, aircraft flying overhead.
As the Allies waged total war to liberate occupied Europe.
This was a war in which all sides were learning as they went.
From the beaches of Normandy,
the water was full of blood. The water was bright red.
To the forests of Germany.
Ich sehe dort heute noch die ganzen Toten liegen.
Both sides deployed weapons of ever greater power and sophistication.
And this tank suddenly gives the American a real big advantage. It's a very effective beast.
This is the story of the Western Allies' final campaign, told by the men on both sides who were there.
You did what you did. You fire and you maneuver.
He was my brother.
The 16th of December, 1944. Hitler unleashed his final gamble in the West, a surprise counterattack in the dense forest of the Ardennes. He hoped it would change the course of the war and force the Allies to the negotiating table.
Der letzte Hitlerbefehl lautete, es kommt nicht darauf an, Geländegewinne zu machen, sondern es kommt darauf an, den Feind zu vernichten.
This is the story of America's deadliest battle of World War II, the Battle of the Bulge. By early December 1944, German soldiers were fighting a desperate battle to halt the Red Army's advance on the Eastern Front, as the Russians closed in on Germany. But in the West, recent German successes against Montgomery's airborne operation, Market Garden, and on the Ruhr River against the Americans, had brought a brief period of respite. They had now assembled a formidable strike force to carry out the Führer's plan for a counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg to take out a critical Allied supply port.
The plan that was proposed by Hitler was that the German troops would advance through the Ardennes and reach the port of Antwerp, the big logistical hub of the Allied forces, and cut off the Allied supply of the troops fighting in and around the German border. The second objective was a political one, and by launching this offensive, Hitler wanted to show the Western Allies that there was still a lot fight left in the Germans, and he was trying to convince them it would be a good idea to make peace with the Germans and form an alliance with the Germans and fight together with the Germans against the Soviets.
The German army would attack through the same region where it had won its brilliant Blitzkrieg victory against France in 1940, the Ardennes, a rugged landscape of forest and hills spanning Belgium, France, and Luxembourg.
If you got into the Ardennes, you would go back to the 15th and 16th century. It had castles with moats and wooden drawbridges and things like that. And it was just absolutely beautiful.
Allied forces were thinly spread in this area. A quiet sector where units battered and exhausted after spending weeks in the bloody fighting along the Siegfried line could recover.
We came to relieve the 4th Infantry Division that was in Hürtgen Forest. They had lost 6,000 men. The 2nd Infantry had lost 2,000 men. They were all sent there to recuperate, get replacements, get back up to force.
But this quiet sector was about to bear the brunt of the most ferocious German offensive since D-Day. Unknown to the Allies, more than 200,000 men, 1,400 armored vehicles, 1,000 aircraft, and 2,600 guns and rocket launchers had been assembled for the task ahead. Adolf Hitler personally selected the best troops available and officers he trusted. 6th Panzer Army under SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich included two of the most powerful formations at Germany's disposal, the 1st SS and 2nd SS Panzer Corps. General von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army also contained several experienced panzer formations. They were supported by the 7th Army under General Brandenberger and 15th Army under General von Zangen. The lead role in the attack was given to 6th Panzer Army, assigned the shortest route to the primary objective, the critical Allied supply port of Antwerp. They had priority for supply and equipment. The 5th Panzer Army was assigned to the middle sector with the objective of capturing Brussels. In the southernmost sector, the 7th Army's task was to defend the flank of the main assault. The 15th Army, located on the far north of the Ardennes battlefield, was tasked with holding US forces in place, with the possibility of launching its own attack if things went well. But Field Marshals Walter Model and Gerd von Rundstedt, who were in charge of the operation, had serious concerns. Hitler wouldn't hear of them.
There were a number of problems they saw with the plan for the Ardennes offensive. The first one was that they thought the German troops were simply not strong enough. Germany had assembled pretty much the last reserves, you might say, for this big offensive, but they were still being outnumbered by the Allies. Second thing was that logistics was not really on the German side. The Germans actually, in their plans, made sure and pointed out that they would have to capture Allied petrol depots in order to keep the German tanks rolling.
Fuel was a major part of the German supply problem in the latter part of the Second World War. The major issue was that the Russians had now overrun the Romanian oil fields. Germany had barely enough fuel to keep her tanks running and her planes in the air.
If the Germans were to achieve any success, the High Command knew they would need complete surprise and hoped the winter weather would be on their side, negating the Allies' overwhelming air superiority. But above all, they needed to reach objectives quickly before the enemy could organize their response and bring in enough reinforcements to halt the advance. The main thrust would be under the command of one of Hitler's most trusted officers, Sepp Dietrich. Josef Sepp Dietrich was a staunch Hitler loyalist who held the most senior military rank in the SS. In the early days, this decorated World War I veteran had been Hitler's chauffeur and bodyguard, and participated in the purge of the Nazi Party, known as the Night of the Long Knives, in 1934. He enjoyed the Führer's complete trust. For his exploits as a corps commander in Normandy, Hitler awarded diamonds to Dietrich's Knight's Cross, Nazi Germany's highest decoration. But his lack of education or training created problems at higher command. It was said he was unable to read a military map. German morale was high. Recent successes against the Allied advance had been dubbed the miracle in the West. Some even believed the tide of the war might be about to turn.
Da hat man wirklich das Gefühl, ja, haben wir den Glauben, jetzt geht's noch mal nach vorn, jetzt gewinnen wir, können wir doch noch mal den Krieg gewinnen.
Planning and preparation was meticulous, and the build-up went ahead with every precaution for maintaining secrecy. The Germans minimized the use of telephone landlines and forbade the use of wireless transmissions that might be intercepted. Freezing fog prevented the Allies carrying out air reconnaissance. As a result, the Allies were virtually blind to the German build-up. The ground froze hard, making it excellent going for heavy German tanks on the move. It was the moment they had been waiting for. On the 16th of December 1944, at 5:30 a.m., 1,600 German artillery guns opened fire.
Das war ein unablässiges Dröhnen, Heulen, Orgeln von Granaten, von Raketenwerfern. Es war eine Qualmwand, die da aufstieg, und darin zuckten die Detonationsblitze auf in verschiedenen Farben. Also es war ein schaurig schönes Inferno.
90 minutes later, the Germans attacked US positions along a 40-mile front.
Also sowas hatte ich vorher noch nie erlebt. Da war ja nochmal alles an Panzern und was wir hatten, die neuesten Panzer, Artillerie zusammengezogen. Die Amerikaner waren ja völlig überrascht. Die haben zum Teil, stand der heiße Kaffee noch in Kannen am Tisch und der Frühstücksspeck und Rühreier. So sind die gelaufen, die waren ja völlig überrascht.
US 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions suddenly found themselves in the path of the German spearhead, Kampfgruppe Peiper, commanded by an officer who represented everything the SS stood for. Only 29 years old, Joachim Peiper was a dedicated Nazi who turned 18 the day Hitler came to power and secured a place in Sepp Dietrich's elite Leibstandarte SS division in 1936. He was close to many of the Nazi hierarchy and had served on the personal staff of Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, second only to Hitler himself. But Peiper was no desk jockey. His combat record earned him a reputation as a bold and aggressive leader, the admiration of his men, and Germany's highest military decoration, the Knight's Cross. He was also linked to many atrocities committed by the division against civilians and prisoners of war. Peiper's unit became known as the Blowtorch Battalion, a nickname that was said to come from the slaughter and burning of Soviet villages. The coming days would only add to Peiper's savage reputation. Peiper's battle group was 600 vehicles and 5,000 men strong, including a detachment of formidable King Tiger tanks.
Despite the impressive nature of the Tiger I, the German military stops making them in the summer of 1944, and they move on to an even more impressive beast, the King Tiger or Royal Tiger, Tiger II. And that's built because Hitler insists that the newer 88mm gun, which is even longer, even more powerful, is put on a tank chassis. For the Ardennes attack, one of the biggest problems the Germans faced was logistics. Keeping tanks like this King Tiger on the road was a real problem. The supplies, keeping them moving forward, despite the fact that the Germans had stockpiled fuel, Albert Speer, the armaments minister, sees these stockpiles are still at some of the railheads. They haven't moved forward to the frontline troops.
To protect such valuable vehicles in the opening stages of the battle, infantry were pushed forward to clear the way for the tanks. The first place enemy resistance was expected was the tiny Belgian village of Lanzarat on the edge of the Ardennes forest. Peiper held his tanks back, while German infantry secured the area. Lanzarat's tiny American garrison was hopelessly outnumbered, but opened fire on the approaching German troops.
The German troops withdraw, and they start basically digging in, and they stay in their positions for several hours.
12 hours later, and behind schedule, Peiper and his tank column arrived on the scene.
So at that point, Peiper gets very angry, and he pushes forward with his battle group to find that the Americans have withdrawn several hours earlier and that the wood had been empty and no Americans had been there for quite some time. So this episode throws into turmoil the German plan for the advance.
After the costly delay at Lanzarat, Peiper's armored column made rapid progress, and a few kilometers further on at Hunsfeld, they ran into one of the 99th Division's rest centers, full of bewildered American troops, many of whom were soon taken prisoner. Then he made a detour north, to Bullingen.
At Bullingen, Kampfgruppe Peiper, under the command of Joachim Peiper, captured a large Allied fuel depot, which made it possible for this particular unit and subsequent units to continue their advance.
Here, Peiper's column also found use for the captured American soldiers.
they suddenly realized that they have Allied fighter planes overhead. And what would normally happen is that these would now engage and start strafing the German tank column. So the Germans take a number of the American prisoners that they have and basically use them as human shields and put them in front of their vehicles to prevent the Americans from attacking. And this is exactly what happens. So the account that we have is that the American pilots in frustration are circling over the German formation but do not engage. And Kampfgruppe Peiper manages to get away.
Peiper continued his advance west, unaware that if he had turned north, he had an opportunity to flank and trap the entire US 2nd and 99th Divisions. Later that day, his force ran into a US artillery unit at Bastogne. The American column of 26 vehicles was hopelessly outgunned and had no choice but to surrender. The men were taken into a nearby field, along with other POWs that had been captured earlier.
Everybody was lined up in the field then. And the German soldiers were coming by, you know, half-tracks and vehicles, and after that, the foot soldiers were coming by too.
The prisoners suddenly found their captors were covering them with machine guns, which then opened fire.
I got hit in both legs then with the machine gun fire. And they started coming through, and anybody would holler or say something, they shoot them, laying there. I said, good God, I hope they miss me. And they did.
While some, like Albert Valenci, had a lucky escape in the chaos, at least 84 out of 125 prisoners were killed. Many later found to have been finished off by a shot to the head or a rifle butt. The Malmedy massacre was the largest single massacre of prisoners by Peiper's men in the Ardennes campaign, but not the last.
The way I think that they were on a timetable, that's the only thing I could think. They didn't have time to be fooling around with prisoners or anybody. That's the only thing I can think, is they were in a big hurry.
The Waffen-SS, who in some cases regarded what other people saw as war crimes as part of their style of warfare, and this shows up very clearly in the Battle of the Bulge. The actual orders given are that prisoners should not be allowed to delay the advance. And German army units largely interpret this to mean disarm prisoners and tell them to march east, possibly under an escort, but don't spend any time trying to do too much with them. The Waffen-SS interpretation is that prisoners are to be shot.
Word of the massacre quickly spread among Allied forces. Some American troops took matters into their own hands, carrying out reprisals against German SS prisoners. Many decided that now they'd rather fight on to the end than risk being taken prisoner. The very next day, Peiper's column would commit an even greater atrocity, this time upon unarmed civilians at the village of Stavelot. At dawn on the 18th of December, Peiper's armored column attacked a US anti-tank unit, driving them out of Stavelot. They rolled into a village that was now undefended, leaving only the villagers.
Toute la colonne de Peiper est passée devant ma maison. Il y avait des gros chars, des half-track, comme on dit en anglais, et les panzergrenadiers suivaient, mais on n'osait pas se montrer. On avait réellement peur.
Peiper's column opened fire on the villagers.
Maman crie en allemand, elle dit, écoutez, nous sommes des civils, mais malgré tout, ils ont tiré. Donc ils sont revenus une deuxième fois, ils ont encore retiré parce que ça bougeait encore un peu, donc maman a été tuée, mes deux sœurs.
A few days later, US forces entered the town and found horrific scenes.
In the first house I went into, an elderly couple, a man and a woman, they were real old, and they were lying on the floor in a pool of blood. And the blood was frozen, and I looked at them and examined them. They had been shot through the head, and their throats were cut. So they were, it was frozen blood, and I was very shocked to see this. There was a woman in there who didn't have any clothes on, and her left arm was hacked off. And there was a baby in there that was dead. And every house that I went to was just like that over and over.
Peiper's SS added to their grim record, murdering more than 100 Belgian civilians in and around Stavelot. The Allies had worked out that the Germans were relying on captured fuel to keep their vehicles moving. So they hurriedly began to destroy all the fuel dumps that lay in the path of the German advance. While Peiper, moving west out of Stavelot, completely missed the main American fuel dump just north of the village. Peiper's progress depended on events on the Elsenborn Ridge, a line on the north shoulder of the battle.
The key for Peiper and his advance is if he can make sure that not only is he pushing forward, but that his lines of supply and reinforcement are protected. And the problem is that those lines are dominated by a geographic feature called the Elsenborn Ridge, which is held by American units. There's a German force that is tasked with knocking the Americans off of that, the 12th SS Panzer Division. And this is really the key to whether Peiper can keep going. If the 12th can knock the Americans off of there, Peiper's got a much better chance of making a deep penetration. If they can't, then his advance is going to stall out even before it started.
But the 12th SS Panzer, supported by the 506th Heavy Tank Battalion, were in difficulty, held up at the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath. It was an intense battle that was costing them dearly in blood, tanks, and time. All that day and into the night, the battle raged, with SS tank and assault guns hitting the villages from the east, supported by a barrage of Nebelwerfer rockets. While from the west came a hailstorm of American artillery shells, fitted with special fuses.
One thing that we had that was superior to Germany, we had a proximity fuse on our artillery pieces. Proximity fuse was a device. If you wanted the artillery to explode 100 feet above ground, 200 feet or whatever distance above ground, you could set it and it would explode without ground contact. Germans had nothing like that.
American artillery threw back repeated German infantry assaults, while howitzers and anti-tank teams took out German panzers. US forces withdrew to positions on the Elsenborn Ridge and dug in along a new defensive line. They had no intention of yielding more ground to the German advance. But US troops found their entrenching tools hardly made an impression on the frozen ground, leading to a drastic new approach.
They gave us quarter-pound blocks of TNT. The engineers had little blocks of TNT, and they finally wised up that there was no way we could dig through this frozen tundra. So they issued us these blocks of TNT, and we'd put them in the ground, and they would slowly blow the hole open and get the top part off. Then you could sort of dig a little bit. But that's the only way we got the foxhole dug.
Peiper's spearhead, meanwhile, had run into fierce resistance as US engineers blew up bridges in front of and behind him. Not only threatened with being cut off from supply and reinforcement, German troops knew they'd be sitting ducks for Allied aircraft as soon as the clouds cleared. One American spotter plane managed to fly under the cloud cover and locate his column, directing fighter bombers to the attack. Peiper's battle group could advance no further and was forced onto the defensive. Just 3 days into Hitler's offensive, the stubborn resistance of a mixed bag of US units had frustrated Hitler's main hope for the battle.
We had a lot of casualties from artillery and everything, but we didn't go out on combat patrols. We had none of this going out beyond the line. We just sat where we were, held the line.
With Peiper bottled in, all hopes of achieving a breakthrough now hinged on Hitler's other major strike force, the 5th Panzer Army. Attacking simultaneously with Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army in the north, the offensive here offered a real chance of German success. Their objectives included the towns of Saint-Vith and Bastogne, and ultimately the Belgian capital, Brussels. On the night of the attack, the Germans bounced searchlight beams off the clouds to create artificial moonlight for the advance. A brief artillery barrage further warned the Allies that an attack was on its way. In command was one of Germany's best panzer generals. Nicknamed Kleiner, Little One, because of his short stature, General Hasse von Manteuffel was a highly decorated and skillful commander, arguably the best of the German generals involved in the Ardennes offensive. As an early exponent of armored warfare, he had his own ideas on how best to achieve a breakthrough, and was skeptical of Sepp Dietrich's plan to attack along a narrow corridor. He had decided that his 5th Panzer Army would instead attack on a broad front, on the basis that, as he put it, if we knock on 10 doors, we will find several open. Standing in the path of the 5th Panzer Army's advance were 2 thinly spread US infantry divisions, the 28th and the inexperienced 106th.
The initial response of the American commanders in the area, people like Bradley and Eisenhower, was that this was just a minor counterattack, straightening of the lines, or something local that the Germans were doing. They didn't think that the Germans were capable of or wanted to mount a counteroffensive in the Ardennes. And so, among other things, they had actually put second-line troops in that sector, troops in need of rest, inexperienced divisions.
US 28th Division were veterans of the battle for Hürtgen Forest, where they'd suffered heavy losses. They'd been sent to the Ardennes to rest and rebuild, but their respite would be short-lived. One 10-mile stretch of front was held by just 2 battalions, 2,000 men, about to face 31,000 Germans, along the main road to the strategically vital town of Bastogne. Whole regiments found themselves isolated by the advancing German forces. And to sow further confusion among US troops, the Germans had launched a clandestine operation codenamed Greif. It was headed by legendary German commando Otto Skorzeny, seen here being interrogated by his American captors after the war. Operation Greif involved disguising English-speaking Germans in American uniforms, even riding in captured Allied vehicles. Dubbed Panzer Brigade 150, their objective was to cause as much havoc as possible, cutting cables, moving road signs and minefield warnings, and gathering intelligence.
Wir saßen im Schiff, Kaugummi essen, amerikanische Zigaretten. Ich habe mit einem gesprochen, hat auch englische Zeitungen oder amerikanische. Was macht ihr? Ja, die waren auch ziemlich verschwiegen. Ich habe sich nur gegrenzt.
So there was a lot of infiltration going on. And as that word got around that we were being infiltrated, any little sound that you heard, you just automatically assumed it was somebody sneaking up on you. So the nervousness increased quite a bit.
Very, very few of them actually could stand a check. And of course, Americans had a terrible time asking each other trick questions about who's Betty Grable's husband, or what's a Texas Liga. It's a baseball term, by the way.
They knew about Lou Gehrig, and they knew about the Yankees and the Giants, and many of them had lived in the United States at one time. So they were able to get by And then the troops behind them were accepted if they had similar kind of equipment. Even though they didn't speak English, they could get by.
One way you could spot these men was that they were so short of equipment that they would drive with 4 people in a jeep. The Americans had so many jeeps, if they had 4 men, they used 2 jeeps, 3 was the maximum. Probably the most important effect was that General Eisenhower was in effect imprisoned by his own staff in his headquarters, because they were afraid that these men were going to drive all the way to Paris and Versailles, perhaps, and try and assassinate him. And Eisenhower eventually got fed up with this and announced that somebody could shoot him if they wanted to, but he was going to get out and find out about the battle.
This paranoia caused by Skorzény's men translated into a hard attitude towards some German prisoners.
We wanted to know where more of the Germans in American uniforms were, because that was necessary to save our skins, if you know what I mean. We said we will give him 5 seconds to answer the question, and if he didn't, we was gonna blow his brains out. And in some cases, we blew his brains out. I said, you know, after that, we had no problem at all getting all the answers we wanted.
Most of the German infiltrators were soon caught and faced only one possible sentence.
Ich möchte sagen, es war ja für die Jungs ein Himmelfahrtskommando. Wäre wahrscheinlich auch nicht anders gewesen, wenn wir Amerikaner in deutschen Uniformen erwischt hätten, die da so allerhand angestellt haben.
I needed that information to save the people in my platoon, as well as my battalion. And I had no hesitation. And I've seen what they've done to us and what they did to our people in Normandy, especially. I had no sympathy for any of them.
Events were moving quickly, but not quickly enough for the Germans. Saint-Vith was a key crossroads on the boundary between Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army and Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army. The Germans had planned to take it on the 2nd day, but it held out for 5. With so many armoured vehicles, horse-drawn artillery and troops moving along the forest roads, traffic jams also began to slow down the German advance and prevent much-needed supplies reaching forward units. To ease congestion on the roads, the Germans needed to take control of the crossroads at Bastogne, and Manteuffel's forces were heading straight for it. Allied commanders scrambled for any means to slow down the German advance on Bastogne. Reserves were rushed forward, among them the famous 82nd and 101st US Airborne divisions, hard-bitten veterans of D-Day and Operation Market Garden.
A runner came down to where I was in one of the barracks there, and he says, the colonel wants to see you right away. Well, he didn't have to tell me which colonel. I knew which colonel is my battalion commander. So I took off up the road. I knew something was serious. And he says, we are moving out as soon as we can load the trucks, which are coming in now, and going to a town called Bastogne, because we got to get there before the Germans do and stop the railroad, stop the highways.
Some paratroopers were on their way to Paris for some R&R after 72 days on the line in Holland.
The military police picked us up 12 miles outside of Reims while we were heading to Paris. Said we had to come back to get on trucks to go somewhere where we didn't know. Nobody knew where we were going to go.
So sure enough, we got on these trucks, rode for 2 or 3 days, and dismounted just south of the town of Bastogne. And nobody knew what the situation was. If there was, they weren't going to tell. And we double-timed about 10 or 12 miles through the town of Bastogne and took up a perimeter position.
This hurried deployment would have a crucial impact on the outcome of the battle.
Once the Allied High Command realized that this was a substantial German attack, Eisenhower gathered his main commanders, Montgomery and Bradley and Patton, among others, at a meeting to start strategizing about how to react.
The American forces standing in the path of the German offensive belonged to the US First Army, commanded by General Courtney Hodges. To the north was British 21st Army Group, commanded by Field Marshal Montgomery. To their south was the US Third Army, under General Patton.
The decision was that Montgomery would turn his forces southward to attack the northern edge of the German salient, and that Patton would turn his forces northward against the southern edge of the salient and both relieve American defenders but also pinch off the bulge that the Germans had created. And when Eisenhower asked Montgomery how long it would take him to get moving, Montgomery, who was normally obviously a very cautious guy, said about 2 weeks to turn his forces and head southward. When Eisenhower turned to Patton and asked the same question, Patton said 48 hours. And Montgomery chided him. George, you can't do that. You know you can't do that. And Patton said 48 hours. And so Eisenhower said, okay, I don't believe you, but okay. And Patton confessed to Bradley that he had actually started the Third Army moving northward, turning towards the attack even before the meeting with Eisenhower, because he was pretty sure what Eisenhower was going to ask him to do. And that's one of the aggressive, self-confident things that really made the legend of George Patton.
A week before Christmas 1944, the US 101st Airborne arrived in Bastogne to shore up the line. Not a moment too soon.
Refugees were coming in to Bastogne from the way I was going, and I knew what that meant. The Germans weren't very far behind.
As the 101st arrived in Bastogne, rumors spread among the troops that they were already cut off. The Germans had surrounded the town.
We were cut off, and our whole medical company that was on the tail end of our command was cut off. They were captured, the whole command.
Oh, it went from bad to worse. When we arrived at Bastogne, there was no snow on the ground at all. The next night, it started snowing. It snowed before it stopped about knee-deep.
In these freezing conditions, the 101st Airborne would have to hold out with dwindling supplies and buy the Allies desperately needed time. US paratroopers were sent to Bastogne in such a rush, little thought was given to winter clothing or the freezing conditions they'd encounter.
17 degrees below zero. We had no shelter whatsoever, except foxholes. We had almost nothing. I mean, absolutely nothing. We had no overcoats. We had no overshoes. We had no gloves. That's where we got into Bastogne.
In the winter of 1944-45, the American Army find themselves fighting the Battle of Bulge, hopelessly unprepared for weather, which was well below zero. Most of the men were still wearing their 1943 pattern combat jackets, which had been excellent for fighting throughout the summer months, but were just not up to the job for the winter. The men were issued with greatcoats, but again, once these were soaking wet, sitting in foxholes and having to sleep in them at night, and you're freezing cold, all of this just helped add to the misery. And despite being issued with scarves and gloves and woolen jumpers, it just wasn't enough in conditions which were almost minus 18 degrees. The entrenching tools that they were issued were worse than useless. Even picks and shovels were making no impression on ground, which was just like concrete at this time of year. Whenever possible, American soldiers would take clothing items from dead or wounded German soldiers or prisoners of war, because the Germans had been fighting on the Russian front in the east for the last few years, and the Germans by then knew a thing or two about winter clothing.
In the worst winter weather in living memory, Bastogne's defenders, without hope of resupply or tactical support from the air, were on their own. They were outnumbered approximately 5 to 1, and lacking not only cold weather gear, but also food and medical supplies. They had some artillery, but very little ammunition. Among the defenders were the 333rd Field Artillery Regiment, an African-American combat unit. 11 of its soldiers had been cut off during the retreat to Bastogne, captured, tortured, and murdered by the SS. The commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, Heinrich von Luttwitz, ordered his infantry to attack Bastogne, with half the tanks of the Panzerlehr division, while the rest bypassed the town and continued the advance westwards. In a further sign of Luttwitz's confidence, on the 22nd of December, he sent a message to the US commander in Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, demanding his surrender. He wrote, "There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. In order to think it over, a term of 2 hours will be granted, beginning with the presentation of this note. If this proposal should be rejected, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy AA battalions are ready to annihilate the USA troops in and near Bastogne. The order for firing will be given immediately after this 2 hours term." In a Battle of the Bulge legend, McAuliffe simply replied, "Nuts." The airborne units around the perimeter were subject to repeated and determined attacks by German infantry and armor. But despite the cold, lack of supplies, and shortage of ammunition, the defenders of Bastogne continued to hold out. In a few cases, the extreme cold could be a lifesaver.
All of a sudden, out of a clear blue sky, apparently a mortar shell had a tree burst on this tree we were under. A few seconds after the tree burst, Stein said to me, "Are you hit?" And I said to him, "No, I don't think so." I said, "Are you hit?" He said, "I don't feel I was hit, but I feel this stuff. Give me your hand." And he gave me my hand, and I felt this blood on his leg. And sure as hell, he was hit, and it was gushing. A piece of shrapnel had severed his artery in his leg. And it was so cold that the blood was very slow oozing out of him. Saved his life.
Frank Gregg was also hit.
I was standing in the window with my field glasses looking out to try to see where this firing was coming from. And while I was standing there, a shell hit the windowsill. Blew me about halfway across the room. And my right eye was, the medics bandaged it up as quickly as they could because they thought I was going to lose the eye. We held on, and then the Germans attacked again and again, but not at my position. If the Germans had attacked in 2 places at one time, they would have run all over us. But they attacked in a single place each time, and we managed to stop them. Since it was only one place, we'd take troops from over here and put them over there.
For the first week of the German offensive, heavy winter cloud cover had denied the Allies use of one of their greatest assets, air support. Finally, on the 23rd of December, the skies over Bastogne cleared. Allied air forces were able to drop ammunition, medical supplies, and food to the besieged defenders.
We got a break in the weather, and some C-47s came in and threw out some bundles of ammo, and we got the ammunition in and distributed, and then there was a little food And they had about, I guess there must have been 5 medical officers came in and parachuted in and sent them to the aid station, and they started working on the aid, on the people who had been wounded, our people. And I was glad I did, because 2 days later, I was back there myself.
By the 23rd, the Germans had seized the crucial crossroads at Saint-Vite, and some units had managed to advance as far as the River Meuse. But the battle was now starting to turn against them.
While units of the German army had made it to the Meuse, they hadn't made it in any kind of strength. And there was no ability for them to actually get over the river, either in terms of numbers or in terms of the supplies and fuel that they had. And while St. Vith had fallen, the American forces had only dropped back as far as the nearest geographic feature behind it, a ridge behind St. Vith itself, making the town much less useful as a way of getting forces forward.
Meanwhile, Kampfgruppe Peiper had been cut off for 4 days and had had to abandon their tanks. The survivors were now trying to make their way back through the forests to the German lines. Patton's Third Army was now fighting its way towards Bastogne from the south, making a deep inroad into the bulge, or salient, created in the Allied lines by the German advance, the bulge that later gave its name to the battle.
The classic way to deal with the kind of salient, the kind of bulge that ended up after the German offensive had taken place, is actually not to push it back from its farthest reach, it's to pinch off the shoulders. That is, to try to cut the neck of the salient and force the German forces within that to surrender.
On the 26th of December 1944, Patton's armies broke through to the villages around Bastogne. The following day, a corridor was opened to get supplies and reinforcements in and casualties out of the town itself. The week-long siege of Bastogne was over.
You understand, the 101st, we were glad to be relieved at Bastogne. I was down to my last box of ammunition. We had no food, and we were hurting. But we were a cohesive unit. We were relieved and not rescued, because as soon as we were refitted with ammunition, food, and got new weapons and so forth, we moved out into to cut off the German salient. And that's where we had our killing time so much, in the Bulge woods, where we cut them off.
Despite mounting evidence that the battle was lost, Hitler ordered German soldiers to continue their attacks. He had one last wild gamble to make before he was prepared to call off the offensive. On New Year's Day 1945, in a desperate effort to regain the initiative, Germany's depleted Luftwaffe launched a large-scale surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland. The Allies, caught off guard, lost 276 aircraft damaged or destroyed, but 304 German aircraft were destroyed, effectively wiping out the Luftwaffe. A few days later, Hitler called off the offensive, ordering the withdrawal of German forces from the Ardennes, including the few remaining SS Panzer divisions. But fighting continued for another 3 weeks. Throughout January, Allied counterattacks from the north and south pushed the Germans back, and vital crossroads were recaptured. By January the 25th, the Battle of the Bulge was over. Allied victory came at a high cost. The number of American casualties has been estimated at 75,000, with 29,000 killed or missing, making it the deadliest battle fought by the US Army in World War II.
A lot of the people who were wounded because of the cold, died before they could be attended to. In other words, you go into shock and you freeze to death.
Sub-zero temperatures added to the suffering on all sides, with numerous cases of frostbite and trench foot.
Hospitals were filled with GIs with frozen feet, and when you get trench foot, they just amputate.
German casualties numbered between 67,000 and 98,000, with at least 34,000 killed or missing. They lost more than 600 tanks and assault guns, and the Luftwaffe was now a spent force. In contrast to the Allies, these were losses that Germany could not replace.
With the failure of the Ardennes forests, even any kind of negotiated peace was clearly off the table. And the German government began to think about how the war was going to end and whether unconditional surrender was the best possible way to go. It's at this point that Hitler really begins to descend more into fantasy. He doesn't want to concede that the war is lost, and so he begins to really become delusional about what's going on.
Hitler's last desperate throw of the dice in the war in the West had failed. Now, with the Russians moving into central Germany, the Nazis were getting ready to make their last stand.